We're here in Richmond on a close and rather oppressive July evening, and we're on a podcast evening out, looking out over the river where we are now, sort of green, slightly murky, lots of motor launches bobbing, well, not really bobbing, kind of motionless actually against the willows. The noise of the sort of slightly more genteel sort of chain pub gently filtering over. We're here to continue our exploration of the post-war career, as it were, of British reactionary architecture, the self-described traditionalists who stood apart from the modernist consensus, who never joined the programme of post-war urbanism, who remained resolutely and proudly stuck in the past. It's really, we're going to be telling quite an Anglo-centric story, necessarily so because it's about this desired return to a kind of authentic and conservative, nostalgic English ideal, proper behaviour, picturesque views, rural peace, chimney pots, sash windows and the like. In a minute, you'll hear the first part of that discussion where George, Matt and I will trace the development of a few of the most significant personalities.
Hello, I'm George Gingell.
I'm Luke Jones.
And I'm Matthew Roberts.
And together we're About Buildings and Cities podcast. Or rather, and this is About Buildings and Cities, a podcast about architecture and other things.
This is the second part of our conversation about what the people were calling the reactionaries, by which we're referring to a particular breed of 20th century kind of continuity classicist, the people who never got modernism and never wanted to.
There are sort of four key areas that we're interested in, or individuals and little groupings that we're interested in. The first is Raymond Aerith, who trains in the 1920s and then does most of his work from the mid-50s through to the 70s-ish.
He dies at the beginning of the 70s, so...
And then Quinlan Terry, who is initially a student of Erith, and then is the kind of torchbearer in England for neo-traditional architecture through the end of the 70s through to the 80s and 90s.
Although he wouldn't say neo, he'd just say straight continuity.
Absolutely. And then Leon Creer, who's another architect, writer, sort of urbanist, theorist as well.
Yeah, does it all, and I think occupies, of all of them, the most ambiguous position as someone who has clearly belonged to the mainstream of modernist architecture before going over to the whatever, either the dark side or the true faith as you stand.
And he's also someone who doesn't just exist in the UK.
Yeah.
Most of the other people are kind of pretty. He's like, yeah, he's got one foot in the continent and a different sort of set of questions there.
So those are our three sort of practitioner, architect, theorist figures.
There are loads more minor things I'm sure we'll touch on.
And we're also maybe interested in people like Roger Scruton, David Watkin, some of the sort of intellectual, academic people who are backing up this case in the context of the academy in the late 70s.
Well, let's start with Raymond Erith, who I think we wanted to introduce as someone who is a bridging figure, because out of all of them, he's the only one who has both a very short interwar and also a post-war career. He had a sort of, well, actually, I think he was sort of starting to get quite a lot of sort of traditional country house, kind of late country house type commissions, which were still around in the 1930s, before all of that was curtailed by the war.
Servants weren't quite too expensive yet. I wanted to say a couple of things about him before we get to that, which is that he was born in 1904, and when he was studying architecture in Britain, modernism in architecture schools was a niche concern. The other people we'll be talking about are people who are taught in an era when modernism is ascendant. And
like hegemonic, basically.
Erith is at the AA from 1921 to 26, I think, or around that. It's certainly the first half of the 1920s, when it is still very much a sort of Beaux-Arts, broadly.
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of modernism there. It's not quite as stuffy, I think, as some people make it out to be, but it is pretty straight up and down. Yeah. The core curriculum is Beaux-Arts.
I think that the way that it was is that was the curriculum, but what everyone was into was modernism. So
Yeah.
the culture among the students,
Probably including some of the professors as well.
to describe a little bit about him as a character, he was someone who'd been, I think, had been chronically ill for a lot of his childhood, and who was
And TB, as you did.
Yeah, was a bit sort of prickly and a bit misanthropic, and he really took against both of these when he got there. Well, as a lot of people do, he had this rather antagonistic relationship to his experience of architecture university, and so he took against
Full of dreadful people.
I don't know. Well, but he took against basically both the thing which he was being taught, the kind of proper the orthodox curriculum, and also the thing which everyone thought was cool. So on the one hand, this essentially like late 19th and early 20th century post-Victorian classicism, and on the other, the new kind of ascendant, exciting modernism of the sort of vaguely international style.
You've read more about him than me. Can I ask you, what do you think his problem with the Beaux-Arts style was?
I think that the problem is that if you look at 19th century architecture, it's difficult to really believe that this sort of style means very much. You have these quite kind of schematic planning of buildings which can have any sort of different style more or less attached to them, which connotes certain things about their function or about their their character or whatever, but which aren't really integral to the way in which the building is expressed. And then also, if you look at the type of buildings which are being built, when he was a child, and which we talked about in the last episode, they're kind of sort of floridly super abundant with all of these different sorts of elements. They're really fun in one sort of way, but exactly that kind of merrymaking also very clearly represents the ultimate crisis of meaning in the classical language, because it's just a complete collage. It's like, although without the affect, it is sort of like a kind of surrealism of the classical language. Like everything is clashing with everything else. And
which is something which comes up through kind of classical styles several times through history. It becomes a thing where, well, by the late 19th century, style doesn't have to be like Pugin Gothic. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to really have a spiritual meaning. It could just be for funsies. And then you've got all these tools, and and for a while, you seem to be able to get away with doing stuff for fun.
Yeah,
I think
he has a problem with that, and he rather enjoys, actually, in a few cases, knocking all those nice details off buildings and making them nice, square Georgian ones.
I think relatively early on, he has an interaction with Sohn, John Sohn of Dardis Picture Gallery of our live show, and I think that has an impact on him that lasts, of a kind of purer, stripped back kind of classicism, or a classicism that feels more true to him than the kind of Edwardian stuff that you're describing.
Yeah, so let me sort of finish the story of his kind of young adulthood, and the way in which he narrates his own introspection is that he says, like, neither of these things will do. He has these kind of notebooks which he obsessively writes in, where he says, on some days, an argument about modernism and classicism seems to me very futile, because I think that modernism does not exist. When I see a really repugnant pseudo-modern building, I work myself into a frenzy and try to think of the quickest way of destroying these abortions. But when I am left to myself, and I sketch chimney stacks in Suffolk, or measure panelling, or copy bits of plans, then I forget all about the new thought and think only of practical problems. I mean, by modernism not existing, he sort of means that it. I think for him, it exists as like only a kind of purification or a stripping away, and that it doesn't really. He can't really see that there's anything beyond that as a program, and for him, the sort of third position which he finds is sort of to be interested in that like modernistic purification of architectural language, but also to kind of reject its sort of claim to have formed a new and better style. And so what he is looking for is basically a kind of purification of the sort of the traditional classical language, which initially he finds in the early 19th century in Soane, but which with time, that kind of the date is going to migrate sort of further and further back. And actually the stuff that he's really happiest building is from a little bit earlier than that. Let me see if I have another quote, because he says, "The modernists have done all the useful work they will ever do. They have found every conceivable fault in what was the previously accepted way of building, made about 3 suggestions for a new method, and then have collapsed. Their followers, the current modernists, have worked these 3, or it may be 4 suggestions to death, so that they are now as dead as the Doric order. The traditionalists have worked debased copies of debased models to death, and cannot debase anything further. Everything is dead, nothing is recognisable for anything, everything means nothing, and nothing means just what you take it to mean. What can we do?" And so there's this
kind of pleasingly contemporary sentiment.
Yeah. But it's also a pleasingly mid-19th century sentiment as well.
This is basically an architecture school problem. Like, I don't think that's ever been... Like, you get some people who are on the train, they like what's going on. Yeah. And then you get some people who haven't quite worked out what they want to do, and don't like everything they're being taught.
Sure. So kind of classically, the old world is dying.
The new world has not yet begun.
Is struggling to be born. Yeah. One of the things which we've sort of struggled to work out is, in this very English way, is his kind of class position. Because in his self-description, he would love to tell people that he was born in Hackney. And when driving around in London, he would point out, point at some condemned building or other and say that was where he was born. I don't know.
In his Bentley.
Yeah.
Driving in his Bentley.
The truth of the matter seems sort of slightly different. Because they then moved out into the home counties, and he eventually found his home and his sort of long-term location in Essex around Dedham. In a fairly grand classical house. And he seems to have always had quite a lot of fairly significant commissions from family members. And he also seems to have found it quite easy to get into terms of...
elite aristocratic patronage. Yeah. He's working for the Crown Estates, 10 years out of architecture school. Yeah. Which, there must be something there. He can't just have... He won prizes as a student, but there's something more there. There must be more of a connection there.
Yeah, I think that there is something going on, but we haven't quite managed to unravel it. But I think that this is also, for me, this is a classic kind of reactionary, radical place to come from, is to be a kind of loose cannon within the elite. That's sort of...
I'm not completely convinced that he is that elite in his background. The Architectural Association was pretty elite in the people who went there, and he won all the prizes and was very clubbable. And sure, I don't go with him having a working class background at all, but I also don't think I think without him being a very good draftsman and very good schmoozer, he wouldn't have had an easy in at all, I don't think.
And so then we come to the Second World War, right?
Well, he sort of builds up, he sort of gets things going. He gets a country house practice of sorts at a minor scale, does a few... Everything kind of stripped back Georgian, Neo-Palladian. And then, the war happens. He doesn't have to do war service because he's got a bad leg.
Yeah,
so he does do a couple of interesting buildings, one in particular.
Yeah, so there's this very strange church, St Andrew's Church in Felixstowe, which he built in collaboration with Hilda Mason, who was a fellow student.
And she actually got the job.
And the church is pretty strange. It's kind of Gothic concrete church.
Perpendicular Tudor, but in concrete.
Yeah. Where's the picture?
Does it have flint infill?
But it's also quite curious because the sort of
with sort of like soft modernist stained glass as well.
yeah, and the Gothic tracery, if you will, that's being made out of concrete, kind of floats above the structure in places or apart from the structure. It's kind of like a decorative.
Yeah, it's sort of like it has a fine timber frame, a fine concrete frame, which is kind of like the wooden frame, like tight, lots of verticals next to each other in concrete, but somewhere floating between Tudor and
the windows.
Sort of industrial.
I mean, the windows have the like horizontal. They have the verticality of the Gothic window, but without the kind of curving like ogee thing at the top. They're squared off to become more rational.
Is that flint infill, matte flint, or something like
I
that?
think it is.
Yeah. So it's a kind of funny mishmash.
Yeah.
And the interior, like there's a bit of stuff that would be, at points it's got a bit of like post-war church,
There are moments of abstraction and geometric forms, but then also we just pop in little sort of funny ogee shapes as well at moments.
Gothic,
yeah.
Yeah, but it's a kind of concrete semi-rationalization of a Gothic, of a kind of like classic English Gothic village church.
Yeah, looks quite interesting. I haven't been. Anyway.
And it's in, for those not from the UK, it's located in Felixstowe, which is where the big container port is.
Yeah, owned by Trinity College, Cambridge.
Is there anyone in the interwar period building these sorts of funny, abstracted, concrete framed, lightly stylized?
Reminded me most of Perret.
Yeah.
Who is kind of going in that way. He doesn't put Gothic styling on them. The shapes, in a way, are more Gothic. But he will then get rid of all the Gothic detailing. But we'll have other sorts of concrete detailing. What's unusual, I think, about Raymond Erith at this time is not people who have got a bit of a modernist leaning tend to get rid of all of the historicist ornamentation before they kind of move on to getting rid of everything else. Whereas he kind of never gets rid of it. It's always there a bit. There's always a bit of tracery, stuff which is recognisably historicist ornament.
But then is willing to do relatively, in this specific case, relatively exciting concrete frame things, which is the
other people
opposite
are
way
doing
around.
exciting concrete frame things with the kind of massing of Gothic, but not. I can't think of anyone else who would like shove,
ogee mouldings onto the
mouldings
concrete.
onto it.
Yeah. I'm sure there's someone. So him and Hume. The other thing which happens, which I don't have anything really to say about it, but they got one big commission, which was they won an urban master plan in Stockholm, which I don't know how much, if any of it was executed. And I think you can tell that it didn't go that far by the fact that Erith never visited Stockholm. But that was, they obviously had some stuff going on, and the practice was sort of getting into gear when Hume had to go off to the war and Erith went off to become a farmer.
He couldn't be a soldier, had a gammy leg. And went off to be a farmer, and also in search of, in a way, I think, an idyllic pastoral pre-modern existence in the countryside. Like, no running water.
No electricity.
No electricity, no running water, no gas. They kept the car, but they went around with a horse.
Yeah. So I think that there's something interesting and strange about the career progression here, because the type of work that he was doing before the war, I think there were lots of people doing similar types of things. Yeah. But then immediately after the war, he's doing an awful lot of these jobs, or in his own description, he's doing a lot of these jobs where there's essentially no money at all. It's doing, some building a new chimney for a factory, or doing these buildings. Sometimes he will try and do a building which looks a little bit Georgian, but is built basically out of like breeze blocks and asbestos sheet or something, like whatever happens to be available.
Yeah, a lot of charming like infill with tin roof.
He's definitely deeply frustrated by the economic and legislative conditions of the immediate post-war period.
Yeah.
I've got a quote here from a letter that he wrote to Hume, his partner, which goes, "I put in quite a lot of time doing pretty pictures for the RA." So he's submitting lots of elevations and proposals to the RA, which get me more jobs which will never get built. It's a mug's game, but I get sort of a kick when I draw something made of Portland stone and marble instead of chipboard and asbestos. So he's definitely frustrated. It's difficult to get licenses to build in the immediate post-war period, and also, austerity and rationing is still the sort of order of the day. And he's definitely frustrated by that context.
But he does do the buildings.
Yeah.
He is perfectly happy to... He does carry on working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then kind of little by little, he's... The point I was making, actually, just to finish the thing I was saying, is that before the war, there were lots of people who were doing the type of building that he was doing. Immediately after the war, everyone is kind of making do, I think, in the similar sort of context, outside of perhaps the architects' departments of, local authorities or large governmental institutions where it's possible to build at some sort of scale. But he quite quickly becomes, certainly in his own framing, and I think to some real extent, a sort of lone voice in the wilderness, that there really isn't anyone else who is into the type of thing which he's doing, which is this continuity Georgianism.
Yeah, and getting more Georgian by the minute.
Yeah,
really. Some of the early ones have got a little bit of like Asplin to them, or something like that. Something a little bit like, but they become more and more straight up and down 18th century England as things go on.
Yeah. I think early on, as you say, he was entering stuff. So the Royal Academy Summer Show is the thing which architects submit drawings for, that now as then. He also entered one of the big post-war competitions, which is for the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral, where he submits this thing which looks a little bit like St. Mark's in Venice, perhaps, from the outside. These kind of lots of small, flattened domes and things. Not successful. And then gradually starts to pick up work, finding these kinds of clients who I guess are mostly, like, what are they? They're like
Rich people
in
the countryside,
wealthy, provincial, figures. And then around the start of the 60s, the work really starts coming in because he starts getting it from Oxford colleges, and then in the 60s, this big job reconstructing Number 10 Downing Street. Which,
in fact, the whole row, with the exception of the Treasury. So which is
numbers 10, 11 and 12 actually I think there were different levels of reconstruction, but they're all pretty and you can see, I was watching this black and white Pathé News footage where you can see footage of the inside.
It went on for ages, and it was incredibly expensive,
and also it ran up against union problems and just general lack of funds. He doesn't get to restore the interiors in the way that he wants to.
Like in this book, there's a bit of apologism for it. He spends a phenomenal amount of money on it. Like, it was a big project. It's very difficult doing these works like inside sort of institutions that are still going on. They didn't leave completely. Mostly, like, he kind of rebuilt. It's pretty well, not all of it. I would say more than half gutted, like including taking out the whole floors, and the garden's redone at the back, and they actually extend as well. They make the street longer.
There is something fairly fruity that he
does. On the back
does.
garden, on the front, it's very straight continuity. He has a few little sort of fiddling around with absolute minutiae, like the way the lettering is done on the door and stuff. On the back, though, a wall is held up with actually like big concrete lintel dressed in Portland stone, with these very cut off Doric columns going along the back.
They're half submerged, and it is a kind of Johnsoni-esque mock ruin that kind of vaguely suggests that the whole thing is sitting atop a semi-submerged, semi-buried temple in a very repressed kind of way.
Like Ledoux. Does a couple of things like that, where he's got these very, very low columns holding up a concrete thing right at the bottom.
So he's sort of playing around a bit there. That's a bit jokey. It's obviously a very dressed down and very restrained, but it is pointing towards, I would say, more of the kind of pomo gestural laughing than it is towards like so much of a hardcore classical continuity idea. There's definitely like an awareness of history there, right? Or like a signposting.
Yeah, I think also it depends on the freedom that he's got, right? The country, a lot of his houses are from the most conservative people you can imagine. They are country houses for people who are too conservative to have modern buildings. And so they're not going to be, they have like funny pavilions in the garden. There's lots of like funny pavilions with funny columns and sort of expressive bits of like semi-ruiny. But when he can, he'll sort of chuck something in, but they're never that wild.
I think something which is important about his architecture is that it really is about the country, very occasionally the town, but like small towns, country houses or country cottages, buildings nestled in a particular location in a landscape, normally isolated from any surrounding fabric. He does have a few of these like small Oxford College projects, but I think that really for him the proper location of a building is in a green field,
or a county town.
And an Oxbridge College isn't urban in any meaningful sense because it's very much isolated from the forces of the
sure
city around
the car factory was comfortably far away. But I think that's part of his continuity in this. Like, we had Even War right at the beginning. We had the English House. We've had various things, and they all point to the countryside as this pinnacle of English culture and Englishness. That was definitely the predominant notion in Edwardian England that he was growing up in, or certainly when he was young.
And it is literally where he finds his commissions, or where he builds his practice. I wanted to say something about, because I think that this is a good example, the one which is on the front of the book, which is this building. I think it's just called the Folly.
Yeah,
which is from the.
I'm super unconvinced by this one.
Yeah, from the early 60s, and it's this. It's a kind of ovoid tower with a domed roof and with 3 stories and this kind of Georgian detailing. And it's a kind of it's a folly, but it's a not very grand folly. It's a kind of
this is of many, like some of his projects I quite get along. That one would feel really at home in Poundbury. It's a little bit weird, and like I can't believe the plan works at all. And
it is for me in elevation just really quite overwhelmingly phallic first and foremost.
True, it's true. That's true, but I don't think you can hold that.
Not in a good way, though.
No.
Not in a satisfying way. The plan is extremely unconvincing. The circular plan. There's obviously a sort of challenge about how you make both rooms and also like servant spaces within the ovoid or circular plan, and the way in which he does that is essentially just to chop off the top third of it and put into it a rather overlarge bathroom, spiral stair, and some kind of cupboards and things. There's a photograph of the inside, which kind of all of the interior photos of his commissions, I think, feature the same overstuffed 1960s sort of armchair, and the truly kind of pathetic television set pushed into the background with a little ornament of some kind of like holy shrine on the top of it. I think for the most part, he's able to have an architectural career in which he is able to more or less completely hide from confrontation with the modern world at all. Like, he's able to...
The closest he comes is with a design for a vent for the Victoria line, which takes the form of a little Tower of the Winds.
Well, I mean, he calls it Tower of the Winds.
It's
square,
not really,
not octagonal, and it's made of brick, and it doesn't look at all like the Tower of the Winds. It's kind of all right. Yeah. The Victoria line was this like bright, shining. It was the first post-war line. He was, though, although we said he sort of retreats to the countryside, he was involved in the institutions and trying to push the case of classical architecture, in the Royal Academy and with various sort of fringe quangos and things.
And he's building, as we've kind of mentioned, like he's building relatively big-ish projects in Oxford. The Lady Margaret Hall Library is a pretty sizable addition to the college there.
I wanted to give an example, though, the point which I wanted to make. So he has this idea that he at one point tries to make a sort of reconciliation between modernistic and classical intercolumniation. So this is the discrepancy between the column gaps in a classical building, which are relatively much narrower than those in a concrete frame building, which can be a huge amount, or like a timber framed factory or whatever, like the kind of Chicago frame.
Depends if you've got arches or not.
Yeah.
Behind, like somewhere back. The Romans had pretty big ones, and we've talked about how Michelangelo managed to get big ones. But anyway, he's not very interested.
Yeah. But he presents this design for a motor showroom in Ipswich, which is an attempt to do a kind of hybrid between them. Which you can see.
It's all right. Well, earlier on in the interwar period, he'd done a couple of proposals for factories, working with concrete and steel, but in a kind of classical styling. And they all have the like long columned front with glazing. Seem all right. I think they'd be all right.
The particular solution he comes up with here is to do a sort of big fat column, and then a couple of and there's sort of which has an arch connecting to a rather distant another big fat column, and then in between to have a kind of division of these little thinner columns, which are, I guess, carrying a little bit of the load. I think that's sort of the thing about Erith, is that for me he's someone who manages to create a quite successful career by discovering this actually quite large... the whole of architectural culture has gone modernist over the course of the war. A lot of it has moved into the state, which is ideologically kind of interested in the sort of modernistic urban plan, bringing the car into the cities, a certain kind of like mass reconstruction of housing and all these sorts of things along new hygienic lines.
So, the narrative fits very well, like economies of scale, like bureaucratic control. These things are kind of suited.
Yeah.
If not, like, technologically, I'm not really convinced it goes either way, but like it fit with the narrative.
I think that he is... There's a speech which he gives at one point where he goes back to the AA to review the work of the students and is extremely rude about everything that they're doing. But apart from that, he's generally someone who tries actually not to come into conflict with modernism, or like doesn't deliberately take it on, but in fact discovers that he can have this actually quite successful and sort of effective career in a place outside of it. That's something which is going to change in the people who come after him.
But I think actually we might be understating the extent to which he is trying to take it on all the time. He's campaigning for traditional buildings in...
There's definitely the experience of destruction of historic fabric during the Second World War stays with him. And I mean, Coventry Cathedral, his proposal there, he's proposing to do that because Coventry is bombed to within an inch of its life, and the ultimate resolution to that project is like a complete rebuilding in a sort of light touch, slightly Scandi modernism by Basil Spence.
Overall, but pretty good.
Yeah, pretty solid. But like, he's faced with the destruction of a lot of historic fabric in this period, initially by the Blitz, and then also by some bad decisions by a confluence of architects and planners. And I think that's something that we need to kind of register as like something that we can say in these people's favour, is that there was stuff that was destroyed in the post-war period that probably shouldn't have been.
Oh yeah. Well, I think we can get onto that because I think it's not so much of a. I'm not sure how much of a feature of his formation it is, but like obviously, yeah, that's a big part of the story.
He's sort of coming up alongside John Summerson, who was at the Bartlett when Erith was at the AA, and John Betjeman as well, who founds the Victorian Society. There are legitimate concerns around the destruction of historic fabric in the post-war period.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. Have we talked about this on the scale of the ambition for the complete kind of demolition and rebuilding of the 19th century fabric of British cities in the post-war period is quite significant. There's a famous plan for Glasgow, a very major 19th century city, which proposed knocking down essentially all of it, with the exception, I think, of the cathedral. That was the plan. They were going to demolish basically the entire thing. It was, I think, proposed but never officially adopted. But likewise, in the Abercrombie plan for London, there's this very beautiful sort of blobby map which colour codes all of the various sorts of areas, and there's this vast swathe, basically, of everything from the outer reaches of Zone 1 to about Zone 3, if you know your travel card zones, which is pretty much, a huge chunk of the Georgian and Victorian historic fabric, which essentially is, they have a particular euphemism for it. It says something like contains a high proportion of unsuitable buildings or something like that.
Like this one.
Yeah, well, like this one. Like essentially all of the now incredibly valuable.
And actually,
houses.
3/4 of the people left where we are now.
Mm.
The population and building density round here is still, the population density is about 40% down, and the amount of built area is about 40% down on what it was before the war.
Yeah, so I think that is a big element, and it's something we're going to see in the stories of other figures in this kind of movement, this revolt against the kind of callous disregard for the value of the existing historic urban fabric. It's not that he doesn't think he is being iconoclastic, but that there is something different between ploughing your own furrow in this quite like dogged way and trying by sort of setting an example or by like kind of bitching to say there's a sort of a different way of doing things. And there's also something different in the argument for the intrinsic value of certain actually existing historic buildings. And then there's something which some of these other figures do, which is actually in a sustained way to try and create a rival theoretical apparatus to overthrow the dominant paradigm. And that is a different thing. And I don't think Erith has either the means or the inclination to get on with that. That's what I mean by him sort of living on this, founding his career on this sort of desert island out in the home counties. I think that is a fundamentally different attitude, and it's one which distinguishes him from people who come later.
And a couple of kind of corollaries of that would be, he was there before the destruction. He saw the amount of destruction that was caused by the war, and he also grew up in a time where he, I think at least initially, before kind of hardens up, realises the necessity of being part of something that's changing and engaging with contemporary trends. He has this early concrete church. He proposes various solutions for how you should do industrial buildings that kind of feel like the 19th century compromise between classical grandeur and a mill. But it's sort of him taking the mill into the concrete steel age from the like brick arches age. And after the war, he's having to deal with, the state controls the resources, which it had built up during the sort of total war era, and is using those to build council housing. And I don't think he would like he rails against not being able to make a Palladian villa, but I think he's perfectly prepared to go along with the problems of reconstructing after the war. Whereas the narrative changes. The destruction that is occurring in cities to built fabric, like it becomes this sort of there's like a nervous breakdown in some of these people. The destruction we can sort of talk about separately. It is very bad. It's very widespread. It's not as widespread as is planned. There's a strange political dynamic with this sort of post-war building a country worth coming back to, using the war economy to change everything. We've got to be radical. Causes this tremendous energy to do stuff, which in turn does a lot of damage and achieves a lot of things on the other side of it. But at the same time, people are not even necessarily quite able to sort of articulate what they're feeling, and they're building up this kind of nervous breakdown of so much is being destroyed, the country is being turned upside down by destruction of buildings, socialism, new attitudes, feminism, and there's it's a moment of intellectual, mental crisis. And that crisis, I think, becomes the next expression. Yeah. Raymond Erith, I don't think, feels that crisis in the same way. These issues are very much entangled for the next lot.
Yeah, he dies too early. If he'd lived another 10 years, I think he would have got embroiled in it.
And he was hardening up. Through the buildings of the 30s are kind of different to the buildings of the 50s, which are actually, I think, are different to what he's building towards the end. He's going towards Georgian.
Yeah.
From semi-syncretic. Yeah. Like, at the beginning, he's trying to do what was going on in his education, which is this, we're going to try and bring together things. You know, Lutyens is bringing together these ideas from a classical basis, or various other people of the time.
Yeah.
And I think he's kind of starts in that place.
I think we should talk a little bit about his understudy.
I have maybe a good quote that can bridge us over. Yeah. So we're about to start talking about Quinlan Terry, who starts his architectural career. Well, briefly works for James Stirling.
Yeah, in Leicester.
On the Leicester, one of the big
engineering
three red.
The engineering building, which is they're cool. We'll deal with him someday. Yeah. I haven't been to see it.
And it's interesting because
he's really great.
Stirling is a real.
Oh, my heart is singing. I can finally get something a bit more meaty to think about.
But anyway. Stirling is a real punch bag for these people. They really, really, and the people that are going to come and that we're going to continue talking about, they really, really don't like Stirling. And so it's quite ironic that Terry starts and then goes into Raymond Erith's office. This is a quote. This is relayed by Terry to Roger Scruton. Shortly before Raymond Erith died, he had a dream. He dreamt he was in a massive conclave of architects. They were all there, Lasdon, Spence, Casson, every celebrity of the profession who was alive at the time. And a great figure from the past, as it might be Vitruvius, came down to speak. He went up to Erith and said that really, he was not much good. He had got this, and this wrong in his work, and he had not spent enough time measuring classical buildings, particularly drawing them in a sketchbook on the spot to scale. This was the message Erith felt he had to deliver the next day to Quinlan Terry. Measure, measure, measure classical buildings, and always draw them to scale. Not, however, that it had been a wholly depressing dream. Erith said that he had woken up feeling elated, for while the Vitruvius figure had told Erith that his architecture was less than perfect, he had not spoken to the other architects present at all.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's
touched by the little finger of God.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's as much to say about Terry. I think that he is still, I think, just about alive, but has now.
There's a great little on the Business of Architecture podcast. There's one about succession planning, which is all about his son kicking him out, first attempting to kick him out of his office, and then nearly bankrupting it by basically taking out loads of money, and then setting up his own practice with it.
I don't think there's as much to say about him. He kind of carries on the sort of country house line of work, and does kind of quite a lot of really pretty grand ones. Those ones on Regent's Park.
Yeah, the 5 villas or whatever.
He also keeps up the tradition of Oxbridge, basically Oxbridge institutional architecture, insofar as he designs a neoclassical library for Downing College, which is...
How would you rate it? You know it.
Well, I think it's done a great favour by being next door to a lot of William Wilkins, which is lacklustre in the usual Wilkins way. And so it looks better by comparison. I think with all this stuff, it's very strange. The materiality of them is very strange. There's something very
There's a spot
odd.
of the old uncanny valley about them.
Absolutely uncanny valley. There's something strange about the cleanness of the stone, but then also the quite often slightly janky integration of electrical fittings, for example.
Now, I've definitely seen them masticking on a stone frieze with just mastic. And you can see the goopy gap around it, which for someone whose biggest single contribution to the discourse is the fundamental problem with modernism is expansion gaps.
Yeah.
Which is an obsessive hobby horse that he has.
Yeah. I think that we should just say something in case we do drop this into the main episode, that he also does... so there's a lot of that. I would say that the position in favour of Georgianism really solidifies. And he also does this big urban commission in Richmond, which is a sort of whole city block redevelopment.
A couple of city blocks. It's genuinely pretty big.
You're going to hear from us on site there, having a little walk around.
When we formed an opinion.
So we've just been looking around Quinlan Terry's Richmond Riverside Development. We're back out in sort of southwest of London.
Right at the end of the district line.
Yeah, extremely difficult to get to, and then when you get there, it's actually pretty hectic. When did this get built? This was in the 90s.
1986.
Is when it started, and I think
it
it took a few years.
Yeah.
So this is a rare example of the kind of Terry Erith tendency taking on a distinctly urban project, in the sense that it's something which has it's in London. It is on the kind of a busy street on one side, faces onto the river on another, and it also has these routes going through down to the river. And the approach, there's an approach in the level of plan, which is to structure it around this sort of block with a courtyard in the middle, which is fairly uncontroversial. And then there's an approach in terms of an effect, which is to make it appear as a kind of organic collection of buildings of not quite all ages, but of a selection of the virtuous ones.
It was rather the fashion at the time. There's Rossi's one in Berlin.
Yeah.
And there are a few other of these sort of, once they decided we need a different approach to megastructure.
Yeah.
This being the traditional megastructure.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how this really quite studied attempt to give the impression of the accretion of ages, of a variety of different styles built up and somewhat picturesquely and slightly at an angle with each other, but all still hanging harmoniously together, feels primarily quite forced, I would say.
I would say it's falling between a few stools, really, because it's not sincerely trying to be a bit of genteel Richmond. No. It's not aping the kind of language, mock Venetian is not a popular style around here. It has elements which are clearly, at least semi-intentionally, kitsch.
I wonder about that.
But he doesn't really embrace it. He's sort of soft on... He's not really trying to just blend in. It's not really trying to be fully kitsch. And it's not really trying to be just... he's transplanting bits of old buildings. This looks like some sort of dodgy Baroque palace, the one on one side, and there's a mock Palladian sort of palazzo corner, which is like a chain pub.
Yeah. There's a predominant theme that he returns to of sort of late 17th century English country house architecture, sort of Roger Pratt school of big overhanging eaves. Like that block on the corner there.
Yeah,
is
late
very
English Palladianism.
But also, I think also a little bit earlier than that with some of the red brick, there's a little bit more of a sort of Coles Hill or somewhere like that to it.
Yeah,
as well. He's definitely playing around a little bit.
Yeah, and there's some other slightly looser things which feel like they could be 19th century.
The kind of default condition is brick, flat arches, sash windows, sort of Georgian looking, different colours of brick. The thing about this is that obviously this attempt to create this kind of impossible past, wandering around it, you just encounter like bathos in every possible form. So that one has got like a noodle restaurant in the basement, whatever. I mean, we probably not better not get onto that too quickly because it's too much fun and we'll be distracted. There are bits where there are these like Doric columns with very exaggerated intarsis, so they're sort of curving in the middle, very French of a certain period. I mean, how do you describe the design of the PayPal building over there with a...
As George has sort of alluded to already, it's like Catherine the Great kind of Baroque.
Feels like constipated 19th century German Baroque.
Yeah, there's
the buildings are occupied by PayPal, eBay and Gumtree.
Yeah, and some kind of snacking delivery box startup.
Oh yes.
It's different from how I imagined it was going to be, because I thought that the pretense was going to be maintained much more forcefully and with much more rigour. But in fact, he seems quite quickly to have got bored and started chucking in like impossible insertions from various bits of the history of the rest of, classicism, Europe.
And he's hammed various things up. There's lots of things which don't exist.
Yeah.
Not in a huge way, but there's some sort of weird detailing.
There's a funny sort of surliana on the interior of the courtyard that bends.
What's a surliana?
It's one of those windows with an arch on the top and then two thin rectangular windows on either side with columns or pilasters. And in this particular instance, it sort of curves outwards, leans out at you in a very funny...
the Esperantian curve, possibly.
Yeah. So it's a sort of...
in a rather reduced form.
Yeah, so there you got a little bit of... I kind of invented... It's like Roman Baroque steampunk or something. It's this kind of non-existent...
Again, I think you're really overselling it there.
I think the thing for me which I'm surprised by is how much like Las Vegas it is. Like how much... it certainly, and I'm not saying whether this is true or not, but the way it reads is using a lot of historical styles and kind of having a blast with it.
There's sort of three sides, aren't there? There's the front, there's the shopping street side, which really does kind of, it's got a bit of detailing, but it does feel very much like a semi-mock Georgian 1980s shopping mall, of which there were others going up at the time, and great, feels like something which could be in Surbiton. Or
there are some quite funny moments of clumsy resolution that have been spotted.
Sure,
that maybe
he struggles a little with the plans. I mean, actually, looking at them, he's actually not all that good at resolving the elevations either. But he definitely struggles with the plans. A real fine eye for putting a staircase right in front of a window.
Yeah.
If you look into the building from the outside, you're just looking at the underside of a staircase.
You see where the broom cupboard normally would be.
You see the back of the precast. Yes, I think that a lot of it necessarily has had to be realised in actually existing materials. So there's an awful lot of concrete castings which have had a very fine layer of some sort of plaster paint applied to them. I think it's going to come out slightly better in photos. Yeah. Because I think that there are... It definitely...
I think with the right light it could look semi-convincing. It's not terrible.
Yeah.
The thing that it seems more like than I thought is, I grew up around Oxford and there are various crummy, the thing like next to Gloucester Green, which is brick and sort of bulges out, which is definitely not a award-winning architecture number. It's sort of
what is it?
It's a bit more. It's sort of postmodern, light touch postmodern developer, late 80s.
I remember that going up.
Yeah.
Definitely mid 90s, mid to late 90s.
Okay.
Provincial, yeah. Time moves slower.
But it's of that very sort of inoffensive, run-of-the-mill, recreating the forms, evoking the massing of like Edwardian street furniture and things.
Yes. There is a difference here. There is more detailing.
Yeah, there's a lot of it. I think that they really they've had a good go. And I think that there are elements where they've clearly, I think, sacrificed utility in the pursuit of maintaining the integrity of the fantasy. So, you can see that the plans are actually pretty shallow. They're not. You would probably, for an office building, you would really want to make a plan quite a lot deeper than the building that's behind us.
I think he would say natural light was very important.
Well, sure, but I'm just saying in commercial terms.
He definitely does. He specifically does. He says, "I will never." He breaks this promise, but he does say in speeches like, "I'm never gonna." No one will be able to be more than 20 feet away from a window in any of my buildings.
He also says that the greatest crime is not building in masonry, but actually most of them aren't.
For all that though, they all quite clearly have complete sort of forced air ventilation systems, so that part of the fantasy at least is completely broken down in the confrontation with modern M&E.
It's a pretty close day today.
Yeah.
The windows are all closed.
Yeah, it's pretty warm and muggy. There's a corner where they have a kind of double dormer on one of the upper reaches of roof, and the upper set have all got these slats and are clearly where the aircon comes out. Yeah, which actually, those are the kind of moments which I rather like, because I think that they're quite funny, but they're also very much the places where the fantasy is collapsing in on itself.
But that's because those buildings you can see from both sides, whereas the dodgy Baroque palace you can't see from the back, and in fact I think is a stage front where the back they've got a row of big vents on the roof like you do in an office building.
Yeah.
So they've been able to hide all that and put it away. It's proper stodgy, that one.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm particularly taken against it, but it's exactly the sort of crap building that I think we're mercifully free of in London, and heavens knows we've got most of the kinds of crap buildings available.
We're actually sitting just next to one of the other inclusions, which is this sort of John Nash fantasy, is one of those very lightweight cast iron looking little pavilions attached to the side of the building. In terms of the detailing, one of the bits where he does seem to be in quite a strange world of his own is with the columns, which are a very important sort of signifying element of the classical language, and basically all of them are quite squat and have this very exaggerated curviness. They're both sort of small and sort of thick.
Well, that's his sort of Doric ones. He also has a Tuscan one, which is too tall and thin.
Yeah,
but actually all the ones, the same with the sort of Venetian ones there, same with the vermiculated ones over on the palace.
Yeah.
Does seem to be a thing about the way that he draws them, that they are a little bit exaggerated. I wonder if it has something to do with the idea of entasis as being this kind of refinement of the classical language, which cuts against the brutal regularization of modernity. It's not straight lines. It's this sort of gentle and carefully judged curve, which is
it's not here.
Except here, it's become this super exaggerated.
It's not like Sicilian Doric, which is super fat.
If there's a classical precedent for that, some of that entasis treatment, the nearest that I can think is something like Paestum.
The columns are what really pull it, for me, into the world of pastiche. This kind of slight jokiness, and that it's got these bits which are, to me at least, I can sort of imagine exactly where they come from, which particular reference book or reference building or project or whatever. For the most part, they are not very Richmond or very London or even very England. It's quite, which is not to say that it's a bad thing to do, but it does change the character of the building from this thing is about a certain authenticity or location or kind of urban identity to something which is much more of a grand sampler of the classical style, which really belongs to a different kind of ethic and spirit within classicism.
There's funny things
I think there's an interesting rhetorical claim that these people make that I want to bring up, which is the idea that either the ordinary man on the street just walks past this and it sinks into the historic fabric without being visibly new. That's the first claim that they make. And then the second kind of adjacent claim is that like the man on the street prefers this to a hypothetical modernist alternative. Maybe we'll leave that second part alone. But like, do you think this sinks into
the Twickenham proposals have been booted out due to public disapproval a couple of times now?
Okay. Yeah. I mean that's a big component of both like trad and also sort of postmodern rhetoric, isn't it? The appeal to the hypothetical, the kind of populist call out to the hypothetical man on the street. That's certainly a Venturian topos as well. I don't know really where to start with it.
People's opinions vary.
Yeah, they don't have any. I mean,
there are some people who prefer it, and there are some people who don't like it at all, and there are some people who just think it's a bit funny, and a lot of people don't care very much.
Ultimately, it is basically first and foremost an exercise in condescension. You know, you do really have to construct the quote unquote like average person as being pretty stupid and unreflective. Who's to say? But it's not really a place that I would want to go to.
No.
As for fitting in, like on the busy high street, it's kind of easy to fit in because it's kind of everything is sort of leveled down to a kind of greyish actually.
Yeah.
Like especially when all the commuters are coming out and you've got all these like
there's some interwar light touch red brick classicism that it doesn't look out of step with particularly, I would say, back on the high street. Like the NatWest and things are pretty much of the same or of similar, you know, as you're walking by strikes a similar sort of frontage.
It's sort of difficult to know what the straw man modernist proposal that it is that it would be being compared with. I mean, obviously, if it was a kind of Barbican style megastructure instead, that would create a rather different effect and a rather different sort of experience. But that's equally, we could be talking about something, you know, in a very different formal and kind of stylistic register, but which actually might be very similar.
Yeah,
it's not dreadful. It's in the sense of like, I don't think it's a travesty, a terrible thing that it was put here.
No.
I think it is fine, but a bit strange.
Yeah, I think a bit crap, but ultimately harmless. I think that the fun you can have is going around and looking at all of the really bizarre elements, isn't it?
There's two things. There's the like really weird details, and then the like fails.
Yeah.
There's some like ha fails here and there as well.
Yeah, I can't remember. Somewhere there's this thing of Charles Jenks, one of Charles Jenks' early books. He makes what I think is a perceptive kind of categorization of buildings, where he says that the really good ones are the ones which you can interpret in different ways, including like uncharitable and satirical ones, and it doesn't really cause them any harm. Whereas kind of weaker buildings are ones where when you say it looks like a tin can or whatever, actually that really brings it down and kind of is unable to exist if it's not being taken seriously. I was sure that this would be a building which would kind of collapse in on itself when you noticed all of the kind of contradictions and failures and things which make its sort of aspirations ultimately ridiculous. But then when I look at lots of the decisions that they've made, I can't make up my mind whether it is really all serious or whether actually quite a lot of fun isn't being had.
Yeah, but he also pulls his punches. It's not really fun.
Yeah, it's not really fun either.
And it definitely does still, as we discussed, there is uncanny valley territory, particularly I think in the interior of the courtyard.
Yeah, the courtyard is
very strange, Toy Towny kind of feeling.
Yeah, very strange.
And probably a feeling that's heightened by the tenants, right? But it does end up being in that kind of Portmeirion, outside of reality kind of, or like
far though. Yeah. Like,
I mean, the courtyard is really the sort of place where you think, oh yeah, this could be the prisoner.
It then sort of dissolves when you come into contact with the high street, but there's definitely never any like serious inventiveness at the level of form.
No.
Yeah.
And there's
no wow.
barely any at the level of like ensemble.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you regard this as a piece of sort of urban infill, it doesn't have to be wow.
Yeah. It's not so much to aspire to, though, is it?
No, I don't think that's what they were going for. I mean, if you want to be urban infill, why are you doing a Baroque palace?
Yeah. Yes, a Baroque palace that fades into the background gracefully. Gracefully allows the ice cream van and the slug and lettuce to come to the fore. We're kind of at a pivotal moment, so maybe there were two sort of general issues about kind of traditional architecture in Britain particularly, which are weird and which I'd want to maybe talk about further. There's one which you just alluded to, which is the uncanny valley of materials, the strangeness of the way in which traditional architecture buildings are put together, and the kind of curious and often quite unsuccessful effect of things which you're not kind of totally sure why it doesn't work, except that it really doesn't. And then allied to that, I think somewhat separate and more English, what is it about the Georgian as a particular period? Why is it that we go, there are no real like neo-Tudor traditional architects.
There aren't really any Victorian revivalists.
Yeah.
Which is, given how unbelievably popular the Victorian kind of culture is, seems strange.
And how rich, how much there is to work with.
Oh yeah, more. I mean, and it's not even Georgian. It's very heavily built on the decades from like 1730 to 50 or something like that, with a bit of stuff a bit earlier.
Erith might have started off being interested in stone, but almost no one really is very into stone and those kind of the innovations of that period.
One of the things I find better about Erith is he doesn't so much have these problems of uncanny valley. One is he has got a better control of the way you can kind of make stone detailing classical, which is you sort of sketch it up to a nice proportion and then get someone to make it in an established way and just sort of fit it in. Whereas a lot of the modern stuff is drawn to very high precision and then executed exactly as drawn, because that's kind of the way Erith designed his buildings through and worked them out. Whereas Quinlan Terry quite a lot will be doing massing and facades and then will then hand over the interiors to, if he does a hospital, he doesn't do the plans. In his library, he didn't do the plans. He just did the elevations. And he has a big argument about why elevations are the most important thing. And also, there's an argument that is put forward that it's really it's the modernistic ego that makes people want to do everything. And these people are much more flexible. But it does mean that you have another problem of integration of where the duct hits the... and you get these weird... And also, it means you get some really nasty interiors.
Yeah, I think that there is... So maybe I'll say something in defence of the view that he's put forward there, which is that in the era that they idealise, it really was true that architects quite often designed buildings or kind of presented a design of a building with what we would now think of as, like stage one information. If you go on the Drawing Matter website, there's a nice essay written about this drawing, which I think Schinkel submitted to a client for a house in a site in East Prussia. And the complete design information for the building is 2 drawings. There is a plan, and there's like a plan and elevation at a very large scale. And then there is one section through part of the portico. And that is the whole design information for the building.
But the difference is the way vernacular building works. The person that would have been handed to would be someone who is literally basically the person who runs the building company, who understands building. Whereas now we hand it over to a sort of stack of specialists in offices who are like lighting acoustic specialist, library organisation specialist, hospital time and works management specialist. And then they produce a sort of stack, and then that's handed to like technical team who then like work it out. And somewhere in that, the abstraction means that there's a more problematic.
Sure.
It doesn't work in the same way where, and also the 2 sets of instructions are executed precisely.
There's really no room for interpretation in contemporary building procurement.
I think the argument holds water.
Yeah.
I just think in reality it doesn't work that way.
Because there isn't the economic and skills infrastructure to facilitate it to a certain extent.
There might be that, but it's not what's being used.
Yeah.
It's not. There are various things to unpick here. One is that in pure tectonic terms, buildings are way more complex. There is just way more stuff going into them. They're just, by, I don't know, a factor of 10, I would have thought. There's just that many more different elements going in. Also, along with that, has gone a progressive process of making all of those things cheaper. They become much more efficient.
Catalogue picking precise things, which actually isn't necessarily a bad thing, but often
it requires you really have to coordinate.
It's very
all
difficult
of that to make
to
that
do well.
work. And then there's a more fundamental thing. I think that you're right that there's something. I think that you were making a point a little bit about the way in which things are produced, the sort of social and kind of cultural way in which the production of the building takes place, and the way in which information is able to be kind of interpreted and understood. The material is just different. That's, I think, part of maybe a 3-part problem, which is that you can only build materials with actually existing things, and that also that you have to do it through the actually existing infrastructure, social, cultural, and economic. And all of those things tend to buckle a bit when you try and get them to do these things which are strange and a little bit perverse from the point of view of what it's actually set up to achieve. I think that there's a third thing, which is all of these people, traditional architects, one of the words which they come back to all of the time is scale. But in fact, really a lot of these projects get scale wrong. They use these classical elements at a weird scale.
And not a good weird scale. We've talked a lot about good weird scale. We're not talking about Michelangelo weird scale.
No, it's a scale which either is weird in a intrinsic way or is weird in proportion to the scale of the building or the assemblage or the urban context or whatever. So you end up with basically a huge amount of it looks really kitsch and ornamental when actually it's meant to connote a certain kind of solemnity and meaning.
Decorum.
Yes.
This is a very important concept.
It doesn't look decorous. It looks like an enormous man wearing a very tiny bow tie or something like that. It's
it seems to me a lot of their arguments seem quite plausible. I also am not totally convinced about the tyrannical architect model.
I think that part of what makes it unconvincing as well is that so here's a really simple thing. You're trying to build this sort of Georgian-styled house, but actually it's got to have a cavity wall because it's got to reach a certain standard of insulation and performance. And actually the way in which houses are built now, conceptually, that they're meant to be relatively airtight and that air change is something which is meant to be managed rather than something which is meant to happen purely entropically through the
This, by the way,
holes in
I think
fabric.
is a massive problem.
I'm not 100% on board with it either, but that's how you have to build them.
Yeah.
And when you try and build the latter to look like the former, generally because we use electric light now instead of relying largely on daylight, the ceilings are much lower, and so the proportions have become strange.
That's a fight which I found almost unwinnable. By the way, I'm totally out of the game and have you for ages. But when I was, maybe on one thing, I managed to get a 3-meter ceiling height and tall windows.
And which fundamentally, I think you can reduce to the fact that architecture is about working with the materials which actually exist, which are at hand, to use the sort of philosophical term of art. And the Georgian building evolved at a particular moment in economic, material and industrial history as something which efficiently mobilized the stuff that existed and the skills and the cost of labor that were there to mobilize them. And that if you try and just do something now in this totally different era, in a totally different set of circumstances, which looks like that, it doesn't work. It looks bizarre. You have to actually, You have to work with the thing which you actually have. And that's not to say that there's nothing which can be taken from the things which those people are into, the examples, whether the scale.
I think anyone who's heard us at all will not. I'm not even going to argue about that. That seems so obvious to me that you can learn from the classical tradition. You can. I feel instinctively that it should be possible.
Yeah.
And it isn't actually just a problem of like proportions. Like Quinlan Terry's villas have got Georgian ceiling heights, and they're still they're still weird and wrong.
It doesn't work, does it?
Yeah. I over the course of reading and researching for this, I've become increasingly convinced that these people have no interest in winning. Basically, I genuinely don't think
I don't think they've got an interest in winning the political argument, but I think they've got an interest in doing the buildings well.
Yes, no. I'm sorry. When I say that, I'm not saying they don't have an interest in doing the buildings well, but I think they want to be their coterie of outriders rebelling against the mainstream of modernism.
Quinlan Terry literally talks about the persecuted Christians and how it gives them like virile strength.
Exactly,
but
but
they need a period of persecution.
But the only to sort of extend that metaphor of Terry's, it'll be the end of days, and suddenly everyone will be building in classicism again. I'm not sure they actually want that sort of fervent dream to come to fruition, do they?
I think that's kind of imponderable. What it gets at is a tension, which is that they certainly don't want to go back and live in the world where that stuff was actually being built. They quite like everyone. They're all things that we like about 21st century. I think it's important to talk about the Georgians, about the Georgianism of trad architecture in this country, why that is the mandatory or desired style. It's because it is interesting in lots of other. We were talking about this before, and in lots of other fields, it's the Victorians who are enormously idealised.
Prima facie, it seems a bit strange because it wasn't the traditional architecture that they inherited. Georgian architecture was killed off by the Victorians.
Yeah, it was killed off.
It was killed off stone dead.
It was killed. It was not only, but also it itself was absolutely a sort of a concoction, significantly based on foreign imports, which killed off the sort of previous architectural style as well.
Which is what happens every 30 years, there's a bit of that going on.
To try and frame the question. I mean, all the people that we're looking at are pretty conservative in terms of their views. I think it's only in architectural style particularly that for some reason, it fixates in this particular historical moment, as you say, in the 1730s to 50s. And I sort of wonder what it is about that period in particular. I guess that there's a sort of simplicity about it. Maybe it does work as both a kind of purification and a kind of nostalgic retreat.
They do take a couple of other, different people have different emphases, but they also take a few other things. They will hark back to that, second generation Palladian English architecture, with a bit of direct Hellenistic, usually, references, Hellenistic and then Doric Greek. They're not very interested in Roman architecture. They're not very interested in Renaissance architecture, although occasionally you'll get these weird little chinks in the armour where references will come in.
I think in terms of the 18th century, or in terms of the Georgian aesthetic, there's also quite gentlemanly, aristocratic ideals of taste, broadly unsullied by, or at least on the surface appears to be unsullied by commercial interests that appeals to them.
There's actually a number of things that actually I think they prefer from the 18th century. They like gentry culture. They don't like the Industrial Revolution. They don't like the social and political revolutions of the 19th century. They don't like 19th century Christianity for the most part. They're much more fond of either sort of 18th century broad church or 18th century evangelical Anglicanism, to the extent the religious ones, of which most of them are. And
I don't know though, because where does Terry fall on that? Because but Terry
He's a
does
hard evangelical.
interesting, because he does some Catholic stuff, right? He does like
he does
Brentwood
Catholic
Cathedral.
things, but his personal faith is not happy clappy, but definitely no women priests. Famously, he's done a couple of jobs tearing out Tractarian stuff and going and like reorientating Gothic churches to make them go in the right.
Getting rid of 19th century
fripperies.
And also some medieval frippery, where he can. He's a professional. He's perfectly happy to do a Catholic church. Now, I mean, it's very hard to talk to someone else's conscience, but I would say, he would say 18th century evangelical Christianity. Evangelical Christianity of the 18th century, I think, would be his preferred mould, which he believes, actually probably of the 17th century, which he believes to be the true recreation of the early church.
So at this point, the recording is running a little bit long. Somehow, Matt has miraculously cobbled it all together. Thank you all.
Who knew this would be so fascinating?
Yeah. Thank you all very much for listening. Remember that you can get bonus material by subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/about_buildings.
Thank you very much, all you who already are.
Yes.
By now, I would say you're literally making the podcast possible.
Yeah. It's really keeping the wheels turning. We'll be posting sort of more or less provocative material to go with the show on various social media feeds about_buildings.
This might actually be the one that gets us sucked into some kind of big, genuine beef.
Okay, yeah.
That's all right. We're ready for a beef.
I just mute people. I'm like anyone. They don't even have to have interacted with me. If they annoy me, I mute them. Because it's better that way. You'd be surprised.
Join us for part 2, where we're going to continue talking about
whatever it was we just finished.
We'll be somewhat drunker.
Thank you, Matt, for joining us and
Welcome.
for all of the work that you have just finished doing editing this episode.
And if you have any thoughts, if you think we've got it totally wrong, but don't actually want to fight us, just want to have like an actual conversation with us, drop us an email.
Yeah.
We're super willing to. I think we're very happy to engage.
Yeah.
Also, I'd really like to know people's views on like really genuinely successful new classical buildings.
Oh yeah. Do write in.
Not like Chipperfield classical, like classical.
Proper ones.
Proper ones.
Proper ones.
Join us for the next
Join us
episode.
for the next time. It's only gonna. I mean, the next episode is only gonna get worse. But
we know what's in it already.
We're much better for having you with us.
Hopefully, it will be heavily redacted.
Okay. So bye.
And
bye.
so
bye.
here's to
Bye.
redaction.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
But the bottom bit is real Caesar's Palace stuff, isn't it?
I don't know. I think Caesar's Palace might be more fun.
Of course, it's more fun, but it's closer to Caesar's Palace than it is to.
It's Caesar's Palace without the fun.
No, it's excellent. Yeah. I think Caesar's Palace without the fun is like it's a good episode.
Yeah.
Good episode title.